Welcome back again to our study in Romans. Today we are looking at Romans 1, verse 18 through 23. Last week we looked at verse 16 and 17. This week we're going to be picking up at verse 18. Today we're looking at God's wrath. Okay, so Paul's beginning a new section here, starting at verse 18, and it goes till about the end of chapter 3. Today, like I said, we're going to focus on verse 18 through 23. So let me read that. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them. For God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into the image made like corruptible men, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. So, the nature of God's wrath. This is kind of where we're starting at today. This is not the most happy topic to be discussing, but it's a very foundational thing. So that's my first thing, is that God's wrath is foundational. It's why we need the gospel. The purpose of the word, for, like we talked about last week, is that it shows our state of guilt and need for the gospel. So this is Paul's primary motive in proclaiming the gospel. This passage won't help us unless we apply it to ourselves, our own lives. So we need to realize that we have a sinful state in our human nature. By our human nature, we are sinful beings. So why is it that people don't like the concept of God's wrath? I think it's because it goes against our wishful thinking of our human nature. We like the idea of Christ bringing joy and blessing and peace, and that those are true benefits of salvation, but it's not the whole picture of salvation. The word wrath that we see here is orgie, which means like a determined indignation. So pretty much there's another word for wrath called thumos, which is like an uncontrollable emotional anger type of wrath. Okay, that's not what it's talking about here. It's saying this is more like a determined indignation with the wrong that's happening. Okay. God's attributes are divinely perfectly balanced. Right? If he didn't have righteous wrath, he wouldn't be God. Just like if he didn't have gracious love, he wouldn't be God. Okay, so let's look at verse 18. For the wrath of God. So we see it's from God. So it's a divine wrath. So like I said, God's wrath is nothing like human anger. Right? It's not an irrational emotional outburst. It's the idea that holiness cannot tolerate unholiness. Let's look at Habakkuk 1:13. It says, "You are of purer eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously, and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he?" And we also hear that you've heard like God is love. 1 Corinthians 13 is a whole chapter about love. Look what it says about 1 Corinthians 13:6 says, "Does not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoices in the truth." Right? And we see examples of this all through the Bible of God's holy wrath. In Matthew 21, I think verse 12 and 13, we see Jesus cleansing the temple, right? Jeremiah speaks about it in Lamentations 1, verse 18. Achan acknowledges it in Joshua 7, verse 20 to 25. Right? Those are just a handful of examples. We see it all through Scripture. Now, let's keep going back there. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven." So God's wrath is revealed from heaven. So it is an essential part of God's character, and it's rendered from heaven. So from heaven shows that God's wrath in a couple of different ways. Now, like I said, I'm just going to keep bringing this up. Remember, wrath is not raw, uncontrolled emotion. It's not a fit of rage. It's God's just displeasure towards sin. So the first way we see it is a moral order. When God created the earth, he put in place moral and physical laws in place in nature. So just like if you jump from a bridge, you're going to fall due to the physical law of gravity. When we break a moral law, we fall into wrath. Okay, we'll talk about it a little more later here. And the other way I think we see it through heaven is by personal intervention. God is not an impersonal cosmic being who just watches us after he set the universe into motion. We see examples of this all through Scripture of God actually being there, being involved in his creation. Right? Now, think about this. Every single sin ever committed and every sin that will ever be committed is punished by God. Okay? It's kind of crazy to think about. So every single sin that's ever been committed and every sin that will ever be committed is punished by God. So it will either be punished on mankind, in mankind, or it's going to be punished through Christ. Right? But God cannot let any sin go unpunished. Okay. Let's go back there. From heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, he suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. So God's wrath is universal. It falls on all unrighteousness. So Paul's including all humanity here, even the Gentiles and the Jews, right? The Jews are like, oh, well, we're not as bad as the Gentiles. Gentiles are like, well, we're not so as strict as these Jews. Paul's saying all humanity falls under this universal wrath. So who do we usually think, though, deserves God's wrath, right? In our minds, we think, oh, it's the really bad people, the serial killers, the Hitlers, right? In other words, we're saying other people, not us. But when we have a mindset like that, what this is actually doing is it underestimates how sinful we are, and it underestimates how holy God is, right? In our minds, we're like, oh, it's just this little space between God's righteousness and my sinfulness, and I can maybe get over to the holiness side. But it's it's a big chasm, like the Grand Canyons between it. I heard it said before. Right? And so it says all ungodliness and unrighteousness. So ungodliness is that man's relationship with God is wrong. And that leads men to have a wrong relationship with the rest of mankind. Right? That's the unrighteousness. So what I'm saying, every one of us, at some point in our lives, we rebel against God and against God's commands and law and righteousness. Right? We are all guilty. So let's keep going here. Verse 19. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God and did not glorify in him as God, nor were they thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. So what we see here is the reason for God's wrath. All right. So when we're looking at this passage, I thought of some questions here of like, so is God's wrath justified? Or is he being unfair to people? Okay. So I think we can kind of, these two questions kind of sum up these two passages, or this passage here. Verse 19 through 20 kind of answers the first question. The reality of God is plainly revealed through his creation. Right? It says that right there in verse 19 and 20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen. Right? So I want you to think about this. What are the attributes of God that are revealed by the natural world? Right? In verse 19 and 20, it gives us some of them, right? Well, first of all, it gives us the existence of God, right? It talks about the power and might of God, right? The power. It talks about the holiness of God. God's eternal. God never ends. But I think one of the most important things we see as an attribute of God, revealed nature, is that nature, we as creation, the law of God is written on our hearts, right? It's like a built-in thing of knowing there's a God. Okay? It's built into our creation. And I think that's part of it. It says there that pretty much that mankind is without excuse because these attributes are made plain. It says there. Psalm 19, verse 1 and 2 says, right? It's a pretty common psalm. The heaven declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night reveals knowledge. So, what Paul's saying here in this passage is that all people have sufficient evidence that there's a God. You don't have to be a philosopher. You don't have to be some great thinker. Knowing that there is a God is built into our very being. Okay, so then that gets into the question, is the revelation of God in nature enough to save a person? Well, as you see here in the passage, no, it's not, obviously, right? But what Paul's saying is it's not enough to save us, but it's enough for us to deserve judgment. Okay, because despite the plain revelation, it says, verse 22, let's start in 21. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. So, mankind chooses to rebel and worship idols. Right? So, yeah. So, the questions I asked there earlier, I asked the idea of, I forget how I phrased it now. Is there, just because of there being a God, is it enough to save us, right? And it's saying no, right? We know there's a God, but you have to have the heart change as well. Okay, so mankind suppresses the knowledge of God. We try to suppress the knowledge of God that he possesses. Okay, so even, how do I say this? Even if we deny a knowledge of God, right? If you're claimed to be an atheist and say there is no God, right? Still, we see that knowledge of God popping up in your life, despite your best efforts to suppress it. Right? Think about it. If you think of an atheist, if there is no moral code with God, Why do atheists have moral claims, right? Or the same thing, like if an atheist tells his wife he loves her, if you're an atheist, the idea should be that's just a chemical reaction going off. So does he go to his wife and be like, you know what? There's this chemical reaction in my brain right now that's telling me I should say I love you. No, he's saying they understand love, which is part of God's attributes. So, according to Paul, pretty much what he's saying here is there can be no atheist. Okay. We all know that there's a God. Some in our very being, we know there's a God. In nature proclaims there's a God. So mankind exchanges the true God for false gods or idols. Okay. Let's look how Paul describes the idols here. Professing to be wise, verse 22, professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like a corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. So Paul's like, look, it's futile and it's foolish, okay, to try to make an idol. So why is it so foolish? Because we're worshiping the creation instead of the creator. We think that sometimes we think, oh, well, look how foolish those ancient people are, right? They worship their little idols. But we still do this in the present day. Okay? Now, we might not set up little stone idols and worship those, but we set up our own idols in our lives, right? We set up idols of our hobbies, our money, even other people. Things that might seem good can become idols to us if it takes our focus away from God. Okay, so to summarize it, the key conclusion here today is that all people sin knowingly and intentionally. We are justly deserving of God's wrath. I've heard it put this way before. I think it's a good way to put it. People aren't judged by rejecting Jesus. They are judged on their sin. Okay, so what it's saying is they are judged because they have sinned and their sins are not forgiven. So a holy God must punish them because they sinned knowingly against God's law. I know this isn't not a very happy ending, but it's a very important one because it shows how righteous and just God is. And it shows us the importance of what he did for us and providing the salvation for us. All right, so next week we'll pick up there on verse 24. I hope you have a good week.